SECfans.com, week 6. Going to talk Auburn and Mississippi State real quick. Going to run through this one. I'm going to give you all a little love in a computer model and have some discussion about this game because it's going to be a big one, I think, in the West long term. Please remember, Auburn and Mississippi State fans, give us a subscribe, and also in the comments, let us know what your score prediction is going to be and who you think the MVP will be. All right, Miss State and Auburn. The way these offenses are playing, we remember a 3-2 game a while back. We might have another one on the books. Auburn fans are really kind of coming away from this game with Southern Miss after the game with Arkansas and just not feeling great about their team. Is it fair, Josh, to say that when you have a rain delay, which I thought was hilarious, it's like 2-hour rain delay, a couple of minutes of football, and then they had halftime again. But is it safe to say when you have a rain delay, half your crowd leaves, and you come back on the field, you're playing a team that's a lesser opponent, there's not a lot to kill Auburn for in this ugly win? Like, can we kind of throw this game away?
I think it's reasonable, and the thing that I always look at with these games is this is why we have data, this is why we have models and all the junk we look at. A lot of times it's so that when we have these opinions, we can go back and say, does this make sense? Does this thing actually seem out of line? If the model predicts a weird result, and the Texas TCU game was a big example, right? Where TCU was was in most people's eye was the favorite, and that game said no. Our model said no, this is going to be really close, and then Texas ended up winning. It was easy to come back and say there were markers in existence that this should have happened. This probably wasn't a complete aberration. In that case, maybe Texas is better than we thought, TCU's worse, etc. With Auburn, if you go back and look at their per play stats on offense, they had 5.2 yards per play against Washington. They had 5 yards per play against LSU. They had 4.9 yards per play against Southern Miss. And the Arkansas game was a bad game, right? For 2 weeks, their offensive production has not been very good. But, and this is a big but, I don't think anybody's going to pretend that Southern Miss's defense is better than Washington's and LSU's, right? I mean, I don't think anybody's going to argue that, will they?
Right.
So if that's the case, then you have to say, okay, either something's changed and gone wrong, which injuries on the offensive line might be a big factor, or on the other hand, and I think this is probably the other side of it, it's a rain-delayed game against an opponent you don't care about. Okay, I'll throw the offensive line injuries back in there and say the offensive line's banged up. You're trying to find your identity, and you're just sluggish. And I think there's good reason to be concerned after the last 2 games. But I also think you really need to step back and say, it's not like the competition's levels increased. So either they did unrealistically good against Washington and LSU, or they've done unrealistically bad against Arkansas and Southern Miss. I think it's probably the latter makes the most sense for the reasons we're laying out. Auburn is not as bad as they've looked offensively the past 2 weeks.
Okay, so if we're throwing Miss State out, or not Miss State, if we're throwing Southern Miss out because it's, all the weirdness around that game, and we just look at the Arkansas score, 34-3, that's a good score. I know you said it was uncharacteristically bad, but are you a little scared? Let's take the numbers off the board. Defensively, they did great because Story had 4.4 yards per attempt. Running back Raheem Boyd did okay, but he had a 45-yarder. Jarrett Stidham had 134 yards in the air, 6.1 yards per attempt. And they rushed as a team 2.5 yards per attempt for 91 yards. Auburn's here's the scoring drive. Let's go into this too. Here's the scoring drives for Auburn: 27 yards, 1 yard, 10 yards, kickoff return, 72 yards, negative 10 yards. Were their scoring drives. So take one off the board, and their scoring drives were average about 8 yards in length. So we've said Arkansas's defense is better than people are giving them credit for, but they're not that good. So are we looking at another 3-2 type game this year for Auburn and Mississippi State?
I mean, maybe. And I'm going to give you, I'll push back on that Arkansas box score too, because I think sometimes when you get in a game where there's a lot of turnovers or weird things happen, their special teams plays, the offense looks crappy because all their possessions are in the red zone. It is a lot harder to move the ball in the red zone. And we've talked about quite a bit.
It also takes possessions away when you have defensive scores or kick returns, it takes possessions away that an offense could get statistics.
So let me walk through here. The scoring drives for Auburn. Touchdown was on their first touchdown scoring drive was 27 yards. Then they kicked a field goal after a 19-yard drive. They kicked a field goal after a 1-yard drive. They scored a touchdown on a 10-yard drive. They scored a touchdown off a what was it? A kick return, right? Yeah, and then they scored finally at the end of the game they had an 8-play, 72-yard touchdown drive before they had a negative 10-yard drive for a field goal. So following, another block punt. The point being, it's easy to fault the offense, but at the same time, you have to be realistic to the fact that it's really hard to get yardage when you don't ever have to go more than 30 yards to get to the end zone. And it kind of goes to another thing. I think this is a weird point that we can transition into. And we got beat up a little bit in the comments, and then we like to go out, and if people are on forums talking, we try to mix it up with people, and especially, Daniel does a bit, and then I try to jump in sometimes. One of the statements we made that got a lot of pushback was the fact that Auburn really struggles in the red zone when they don't have a power run game. And then that's usually the precursor for the offense struggling. And we talked about early in the year, coming out of the Washington game, which they won, that Auburn had signs that the red zone offense was poor. And when they don't have the inside run, the red zone offense stats fell down. And when the red zone offense stats fell down, there was a direct correlation to the offensive production falling off. So if you look at their past years, it tracks pretty closely that the better the red zone offense, the better the team plays offensively. With the Arkansas game, well, first I'll say people for some strange reason fought us back. I guess they said it wouldn't be an issue this year. I think most Auburn fans realize that it is a problem. They don't have a great power run game, and a lot of it is they don't have a great power run back. And Boobie Whitlow was coming on. He got banged up, and I think that was a big part of the Southern Miss game and why that was a struggle, because Cam Martin, while he may be faster than guys at like Southern Miss, you can't really run the inside zone read with him. He's just not built for it. The Arkansas-Auburn game, finally getting to my point, that game, because of the way the possessions took place, Auburn was constantly operating in the red zone. So we've talked a lot that Auburn is actually pretty good at moving the ball between the 20s, and then they stall because they need space and verticality to operate that Malzahn offense. It's about spreading you out and getting some sort of missed assignment or mismatch or not being able to get the edges. When you get in the red zone and the safeties are closer, they can't get to the edge before the safety can crash down. They can't throw over you, and it really limits what they're able to do offensively. Arkansas was a weird game because they constantly had the ball on the side of the Arkansas 35. And they were never able to really run the regular offense. They were in their struggle mode red zone offense the entire game, and the statistics showed just how much they struggle in the red zone. But, I think if they had started drives on the 10 every time, they would have actually been a lot better statistically because they would have been able to run the offense the whole game. It's just something they never really got the chance to do too much in that game.
All right, so the obvious talking point on the other side of the ball, or the other side, the team on the other side of the ball, is going to be Mississippi State struggles on offense. 7 points against Kentucky, 6 points against Florida, and I kind of want to go a different route. So I'm concerned, obviously, about the offense. And we talked about maybe how Moorhead, if he tried to shoehorn his schemes that worked so well at Penn State into the personnel that he had at Mississippi State, it could be a disaster. I think we're seeing some of that right now. But on the surface, 13 points to Florida looks pretty good. But coming off of a 28 points they gave up to Kentucky and then 13 points to Florida, it looks good in the box score. But what doesn't look great in the box score, if you're familiar with this Florida offense, is 7 yards per attempt from Felipe Franks. And LaMichael Piron had 5.5 yards per attempt. Pierce, 7.5. All the way down. Not a great team performance. Felipe Franks had some sacks. But Florida actually moved the ball okay against Mississippi State and could, based on how they scored against some other teams, Tennessee especially, statistically it was tracking more with like a 25, 27 type point outing from Florida. Are there some concerns on the defensive side of the ball for Mississippi State? Coming into this year, everybody thought, okay, personnel-wise, they're going to be really good.
So I have kind of a weird theory with this. And this year they went from a 3-4 lineup to a 4-3. One of the impacts of that is it's moved Sweat and Green to the outside as defensive ends. And I think that's kind of done two bad things. One, Mississippi State had good defensive linemen and good depth in the defensive line. The guys last year, those three linemen, you had three slots for linemen. Those essentially got compressed down to two, both the defensive tackle slots in the 4-3. Your outside linebackers, Green and Sweat, come down and they're now the DNs. And so what Green used to have Green, Sweat, and then, Lewis at times, depending on how he handled the passing game, and another guy at linebacker. Now you have three linebacking slots, at which none of them are Green and Sweat. And so you've got guys trying to line trying to play linebacker for Mississippi State that I think are struggling a lot, and I really think that's kind of the story. As much as it's helped the defensive line, I think this has taken the problem I saw last year and made it kind of pushed it even further because now the front four is really really darn good, but now the linebacking core is that much more suspect. An interesting point, and I know he's played well, but Errol Thompson is second on the team of tackles. Thompson played, pretty well as a guy coming in, but Thompson was not a high level player. Playing I think as a redshirt freshman last year, and he was pretty serviceable over the course of the season. But if he was seventh in the team in tackles, okay, so Desmond Harris was the star. Leo Lewis was right behind Thompson in tackles, and now all of a sudden Thompson is the number two guy. And the reason for that, it's schematic. It's the fact that when they moved Sweat and Green down, it took them out of the linebacking core, which meant it took their ability, really to some degree, for their way to make routine tackles. They can't move in space and fill gaps and sort of go to where the ball is, and so teams are able to pick more at the linebackers, and then also the DBs. And yeah, I mean, if you go down and you look at it, so Sweat this year is only seventh in the team in tackles. Green's all the way down at 12th. Last year, Sweat was sixth in tackles and Green was ninth. So because of the transition, it's as much as it's made Sweat and Green more of an impact in tackles for loss and sacks, it has made them have less of an impact in terms of the total number of tackles. And I think it's made their defense even more boom or bust than it was last year.
All right, so let's see what the model says. See if it gives us any insight into any of this. Why don't you set up the model and give us just some initial thoughts?
So the model has both these teams pretty good. I mean, the model has Auburn's rush defense at 80% of opponent averages, pass defense 83. Those are very good numbers by both sides. They're not necessarily elite defensively. The pass numbers are better, maybe in some ways even than I thought they would be. 83 is a very good mark. The rush number is a little less. I think that has more to do with the fact that they've played in some ways better passing offenses than run offenses. Their opponent averages running the ball is only 3.9 yards per carry, which is pretty putrid. Mississippi State, 75% of opponent rush averages, which is a very good number. And then 93% of opponent passing averages. Again, a little screwy, part of which is Kansas State has pretty terrible numbers, but still it's kind of hard to judge them in a different conference. And then Louisiana Lafayette's on your schedule. Kentucky and Florida are kind of are what they are. A little easier for them to distinguish themselves against the run. I think it's the short version because in Auburn's case, the other teams they played by and large have struggled so much to run the ball to start with that Auburn's defense doesn't have the ability to show out because they just don't move the ball in any game they play. Um, Getting through, just kind of burning through it. Mississippi State is expected to outgain Auburn in this game. 5 yards per play to only 4 yards per play for Auburn. And Auburn is not expected to be able to run the ball much at all. This should not be shocking. Auburn is expected to get 2.25 yards per carry. Auburn only averages 2.99. So if you think 2.25 is insulting to Auburn, realize Auburn is averaging under 3 yards per carry on the season. So it's very realistic. Auburn's expected to throw it better. No shock there. 6.7 yards per attempt to just 5.1 yards per attempt for Mississippi State. Though Mississippi State at 4.8 yards per carry is expected to be able to rush it reasonably. Anyways, the model's figuring about 4 yards per play for Auburn, relying on the pass, and about 5 yards per play for Mississippi State. One quick interjection here. I know a lot of Auburn fans are complaining about how much Auburn's throwing the ball. I don't blame them to a certain degree, but I will say what our model's heading at pretty strongly. Auburn, if they tried to run the ball continually with the offensive line they have, they would not be functional offensively. They have to air the ball out to be successful. I think the lack of an intermediate passing game is a mistake. We talked about that quite a bit before the LSU game. We even made the comment that if Auburn keeps taking deep shots in the game, that was going to be the way that cost them. That was going to be a thing that cost them the LSU game the way it did last year. They're continuing to do that. By the way, I will say that is a tendency of Chip Lindsey, not Gus Malzahn. And I think that is Lindsey's problem, not Malzahn's. But anyway, the long story short is even though Mississippi State is expected to outgain Auburn, Auburn is expected to win by a sizable margin, 31-12. And I'll finish off with this point and why that is. And it's really the fact that Mississippi State's offensive numbers have been great or terrible. They averaged over 8 yards per play against Kansas State and Louisiana Lafayette, and under 4 yards per play. In fact, under 3.5 yards per play against Kentucky and Florida. This is pinning them somewhere in between, about 5 yards per play. The model does not really know how to scale that. And it's assuming that it's more low than high, so it figures about 12. But that's probably a little unrealistic. That they're probably more like 14 points is more fair. The weirder one is actually Auburn, and we've talked about this before. Sometimes you get a situation where a team scores more points with less yards than they do against more than they do when they have more yardage. Our model is self-training. I don't mess with it, and for every team, our model looks at your own history and trains itself on what it takes for you to be able to score and how you score points, kind of blind from scratch for each team, and it creates an interesting baseline. The problem is, especially early in the season, sometimes you get a team that scores more points when they did bad and less points when they did well. Auburn scored 21 points off 5.2 yards per play, 34 points off 3.9 yards per play. My model thinks that the more yards Auburn gets, the less they score, because that is exactly what Auburn has done to this point in the season. It's for other reasons, but it's really hard for a computer model to see past that. So I don't think the 31 points for Auburn is realistic. And to sort of exemplify that, if Auburn got 10 yards per play in this game, according to my model, they'd only score 3 points. So it's definitely broken, I think, on Auburn's side of the ball.
I wonder. So I know the running game wasn't just out of control last week, but our models kind of messed up with both of these teams. But when you have Hill and Williams combined for 12 carries total, and Nick Fitzgerald runs it 20 times for 1.6 yards an attempt, where the other two averaged around 7 yards a carry. And then he throws it another 26 times, 11 for 26 for 98 yards. I don't know what's going on with play calling, but they've got to be a running back run first team. And I understand Nick Fitzgerald is a good running quarterback and he's not a great passer. I don't know what's going on there, and I think it's throwing off the numbers a little bit because you've got Hill having 200-yard games against good-ish defenses and bad defenses, and then they completely abandon it in a game where they didn't have to abandon it because Florida only scored 13 points. I've not got a lot of faith in this Mississippi State team right now. So, and I think Auburn right now, I think their fans are a little low because they had national championship, discussion aspirations this year. And it's a fan base that should have that. Auburn, kind of like we said with LSU, should be there. I think Auburn is a better team than their fans feel like it is right now because of the two games that, just ugly, weather delay, that sort of thing. I've got Auburn 24, Mississippi State 13, which is the same score Auburn had last week against Southern Miss. 24-13 Auburn over Mississippi State. I don't think the model's that wrong. It's a couple points off for Mississippi State. Don't want to get that hate mail. And about a score off for Auburn. What do you think?
So I'm a little more skeptical. First, I'll note we talked about this last year with Jalen Hurts. We talked about it a few years ago with Trevor Knight at Texas A&M. It baffles me when teams run the RPO and they don't have enough design runs where the running backs don't get the ball. Mississippi State is letting teams dictate how they play offense because they're doing lots of reads and RPOs, and teams know how to scheme it now where they can make sure the running back doesn't get the ball by always taking, in this case, they're always going to take the running back. So if you run an RPO, Fitzgerald's always going to run it, and the backs never get the stinking ball. 80% of the touches went to Fitzgerald in this game, and only last game against Florida, and only 20% went to the backs.
And you have two really good running backs.
Really good bet. Well, and again, Aris Williams averaged 10.3 yards per touch. Kylan Hill averaged 4.6 yards per touch. Fitzgerald averaged 3.8 yards per pass and 1.6 yards per carry.
It's baffling.
So you were more successful running the ball with Hill than you were passing it, but Hill gets 9 carries to 46 touches by Fitzgerald. I'm not sure the math here, but Fitzgerald averaged about 2.8 yards per touch. So that's just really, 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 really bad offensive balance. And what's worse is it's something we flagged going into the last game because it had been an issue in the game prior, and they still did it anyway. But anyway, yeah, no, I think this game's going to be lower scoring. I have Auburn, but 16-10. Auburn's offensive line is really beat up right now. They are struggling to control the line of scrimmage. Mississippi State is going to live in Auburn's backfield more than likely. Now, Auburn, I think, is going to get 2 or 3 big plays in the passing game. It wouldn't shock me if they score over 20 points. It's just going to be a matter of how many they hit, but they're just going to keep throwing it because that seems to be what they're going to do under Lindsey. And they're going to hit 2 or 3 plays where they get a guy in space in a screen or on a deep pass, whatever. And they're going to hit chunk points. And I frankly don't think they're going to move the ball much else the rest of the game. Mississippi State's probably going to be even worse. I'm just assuming at some point they hit a touchdown. I don't like to predict teams to be under 10 points, but that's about where we're at. So I think 16-10. I don't agree with the model because quite frankly, I think it's a little confused by the weirdness of the last 2 games and the fact that Auburn basically it's rewarding Auburn because their statistics were so bad against Arkansas. That it's saying, well, you can be that bad statistically and still score 34 points. So I'm going to give you a lot of points. And I think that was a really weird set of circumstances that won't repeat themselves.
Is it taking all of this discussion? Can the whole thing be distilled down to one team has a bad offense and a meh defense? One team has a bad offense, especially with the injuries at offensive line, and a really good defense. And there's your game.
Yeah, I would agree. That's probably the story here.
There you go, y'all. Could have saved you 25 minutes or whatever. I agree with you. I'm really concerned. I think Auburn's offensive line was bad, especially bad for the type of offense they want to run. When you don't have a good running back or a power running back and you have a bad offensive line for the power run game, and that's your offense, and then you potentially lose, both of their tackles got hurt in that game. It's not.
When Troxel came in for Auburn late, he struggled really, really badly.
All right, you got anything else on this?
No, that's enough for me.
All right, y'all. Auburn fans, Mississippi State fans, give us your score prediction in the comments. Give us a subscribe if you like what we're doing. We talk about both of your teams a good bit, and we'll continue to do so. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.